Hello. Okay, so I wanted to come on today and kind of talk about all things astrology with you guys. Um, we have a lot of Pluto and square type influence in the collective right now, and I thought it would be worthwhile talking a little bit about Pluto and then Pluto and Venus and Pluto and the nodes, and there's just so much happening. And given that it is the moon chakra that we're in, or the moon gateway that Venus is in, I thought it might be helpful for us to really look at the the moon's influence and how thinking through like a lunar type consciousness can help us. I just noticed that my computer is unplugged, so I'm going to pause the recording for a second and plug that in. Okay, and so sorry about that. What do I mean by lunar consciousness? Well, the moon itself is a pattern generating machine. It helps us create meaning in our lives. So, something happens and then, well, what do we make it mean, right? And our patterns and stories help to kind of crystallize or keep those things in place. And for me, I think, I was introduced to looking at patterns and collapsing stories and understanding that so many of the things that I told myself were just a story when I was in my early 20s. And so it feels like work I've been doing for a very, very long time. At the same time, I it's like more recently, some of the pattern work I've been doing is a little bit more detailed, and I've run into being asked to do this specific type of pattern work, and then realized how connected it was to lunar consciousness. And I want to introduce you guys to it. And it's going to probably feel very common sense and like it's not revelatory at all. But please let me tell you what a revelation doing this kind of work is. So I was in a class, and the teacher, in her wisdom, she's a master, of course, in her wisdom knew that there would be a high level of resistance to actually doing the work she was asking us to do. It wasn't just a class where we listened to transmissions and kind of notice things like the class you're in now, like where we're listening to transmissions and then, applying our vision or our focus on a particular area every month. This was a class where I had to do actual work at like writing out the kind of stories of my life in chronological order. And boy, was she right. There was so much resistance to going in and looking at the pieces that she asked us to look at. So the very first thing she had us do is spend a week with our resistance patterns. And what I got to see was that I show up in so many areas of my life in resistance. And it will look different for everybody. I'll tell you some of mine, but just paying attention. So the moon essentially is receptivity, right? And it's one of, like, in the Kabbalah, it's a very important gateway. It comes right after the foundation, or it is the sphere that like encompasses the earth, right? So the 3D plane. And its job is to be a receptacle. It is to receive. But how can we be in reception if we are also really in resistance, right? So for me, it looked like, an uncomfortable impetus or something that I needed to do, get done would enter my awareness or my consciousness, and then I would employ a resistance pattern. The like more physical obvious ones would look like, I'd find other things to do. Like I'd find busyness. I would rearrange my priorities so that the thing I needed to do was so low on the list, I'd never get to it, right? So procrastination is actually a resistance pattern. Um, If it was uncomfortable emotions, I would instead, find a show to binge watch, or I'd, get busy being on my phone. But if it was like something I was really confronted with, like let's say it's something I have to do and the thing is confronting me, like there's no way I can get out of it. If I was really in resistance and committed to being inside of the resistance pattern, I would create a story that justified me not doing it. And a lot of times that story had a tinge of victimization, resentment, and blame inside of it. So, like, let's say I heard a noise in my car and I ignored it, right? And so finally the car is broken, and it's plain to see that if that noise had been dealt with months ago, I wouldn't be in the financial mess and in the mess I'm in right now, right? And instead of sitting with the uncomfortable truth that I failed to be in my adult responsibility and in my maturity, and deal with the shame that that brings up, or the, you know, it brings up uncomfortable feelings. When we fail in some area of our lives, we will be in resistance to looking at that, right? And so when I'm in resistance to alchemizing different difficult emotions about me that I think are tinged with a story about my own lack of goodness, then I create this kind of like, well, if he like, let's say I'd make up a story about my husband, like if he hadn't been so busy and could take my car to his mechanic, then it would have gotten taken care of. I told him about the problem with my car, he didn't take it in, so it's not my issue, instead of the very obvious thing that I could have found a mechanic and taken my car in, on my own, because I'm a responsible human adult. And so it was interesting to see how committed, inside of my resistance, I have been to the damsel archetype, or the damsel pattern, and how often I used collapse or lack of capacity to show up as a reason to resist feeling and alchemizing the difficult feelings. Now, just kind of put a plug in that. I will perhaps place some prompts or something to look at around resistance patterns. But I just wanted to mention that, like, anytime we are in resistance, we are not in receptivity. And so it kind of blocks the sphere of the moon from doing the work that it needs to do. And looking at patterns is definitely part of the invitation with the moon. Now, we also have, let's backtrack a little bit. We had two eclipses. One took place on April 20th and the other one on May 5th. The one that took place on April 20th was extraordinarily potent. It was an eclipse that a lot of astrologers were saying, this is going to be a big deal. And part of the reason why was because that eclipse, which took place at 29 degrees Aries, maybe I should share my screen with you guys so you can see a picture of what I'm talking about. Let me do that. So I'm hoping this is the right chart now. No, that's the wrong chart. Let me close that out. Sorry. I apologize. So I closed that out. So this should be the right chart. Yes. So that eclipse took place April 29th at the 29th degree of Aries, right? So right up here where my mouse is. And that degree point, the 29th degree of Aries, is opposite, of course, the 29th degree of Libra. And that is where we had our Venus star point that began the journey that we are on now. So there was this opposition that took place, and then Pluto at the apex created what we call a T-square. So he was squaring this kind of axis of D. And if you remember the eclipse that took place, there was an eclipse that took place directly after the Libra star point conjunction, on the 25th. So we've been in this like 6-month eclipse portal. Eclipses are related to endings and beginnings. They're kind of like, so eclipses are evolutionary. They show up in our chart and show us, they're kind of like the pointer or the guide. You know, when the teacher uses a pointer to point to something on the board, they're kind of like this pointer that shows us the places where we need to evolve in our life and what evolutionary what do you call it, ingredients are in the cauldron right now asking to be worked, or, you know, in order to create the recipe. There are also points in our lives where we edit our stories, right? So every time an eclipse happens, there's generally an opportunity, and these are cosmic opportunities. So not necessarily an act of our divine will, but something will happen in the periphery of our lives that forces us to change. So it's a place that's associated with endings and beginnings, and transformation and evolution. And Pluto has a similar resonance. It's not quite the same as an eclipse, in terms of how but it is evolutionary in nature. So Pluto is, if you're thinking about going on the journey of entering the solar system and having that be a journey of consciousness, imagine yourself outside the solar system, right? And you're a being who's going to incarnate. Well, the first sphere you come upon is Pluto. And that's kind of the sphere of our ensoulment, right? And the depths of who we are as a soul and our past life memories, you know, that like point of where we become amnesic in entering in, but that like those past life memories are still kind of with us in the Plutonic sphere. And Pluto is, of course, related to the archetype of Hades and the underworld, and he precipitates transformation. He's always precipitating transformation. And very related to the moon, in that the moon also speaks to us about the deep interior of ourselves, where we feel safe and at home in the world. There's a resonance between Pluto and the moon. And of course, then there's also a resonance between Pluto, the moon, and the eclipses. The eclipses, the nodes, are the lunar nodes. So that's how these kind of tie all together, these bodies, right? We've got Pluto as the depths of the soul, that kind of like first sphere coming into our solar system. And that idea of sort of being ensouled and all of the kind of like the eternal memory and the depths of who we are. He rules depth psychology. He rules the underworld. He rules transformation, death and rebirth, and the unconscious, and illuminating our shadows. And then the moon rules that idea of, you know, making the unconscious conscious and the journey of that, right? So while the moon can, you know, like kind of statically represents the unconscious and the shadow, the moon rules the action, right? So like the unconscious is the new moon, and bringing something to consciousness is like that journey from new moon to waxing. And then, you know, the full moon is illumination, is, you know, oh, consciousness, the light of consciousness. And then also how we lose consciousness, like how sometimes things are very important to us and we're conscious of something, but because of our patterns and our stories and our conditioning, you know, our consciousness falls away. And so there's this constant rhythm with our level of consciousness, what we're conscious of, the process of becoming enlightened. The moon kind of speaks to us of that action. How do we become enlightened? Sometimes even enlightened beings, people who know that prioritizing empathy and compassion is really important, we are also human. And so the moon kind of rules that like mediation between humanity and spirit self, as the kind of mediator being the embodiment of soul, right? So I hope I've sort of explained succinctly how there is a resonance. They're not exactly the same, but there is a resonance between the two. So a lot of people, when they see Pluto in a chart, get very worried, like, oh my God, Pluto means death because it's Hades, it's the underworld. But that's not actually what Pluto means. Pluto means, the invitation of Pluto is total transformation. And he's always asking two things of us. Or I guess he gives us an either or question. He either gives us the invitation, total transformation, you consent to total transformation, or you don't. And then you get to play around in the realm of all of your resistance patterns. And I will link to this video a podcast I did that talked about the first time I sort of, well, it was exactly like a moon process, because I began the process unconscious and then became conscious, right? So where I kind of became conscious of what the underworld journey is and what it really asks of us. And I spent in this journey about 3 years being in resistance to what the underworld had for me. And if you've been in my spaces long enough, you'll know when I talk about the underworld and a trip to the underworld, that generally a genuine trip to the underworld, like the kind that's sort of unconscious, like with the death of my son, I was not planning a trip to the underworld. So the kind that just kind of comes out of nowhere and and wants to pull us down, that kind of underworld trip. We must go willingly, and it asks nothing short of total transformation. So the death of the ego, the death of all of our false investments of power, everything we have invested in externally that we think gives us power in the world will be asked. It will be up for examination. It will be up for being taken away, right? Our identities, our masks, everything that's false is up for grabs. Pluto has the option to take that from us when we travel down to the underworld. So we go through different gateways. We end up in the underworld. If you're, I like to use the imagery of the Inanna and Ereshkigal story, where we arrive at each gate. Inanna is asked to shed a one of her holy me, and her holy me. And I love the fact that these are called me's, right? All the things we identify as ourselves. But the me is really powers in the Sumerian lineage. The me's are these different powers that each city has the opportunity to be a steward over. And Inanna had gone and collected and taken for herself all of the me's in Sumeria to clothe herself in on her trip to the underworld, thinking that that would protect her. And at each one of the gates to the underworld deity that stood at that gate asked her to relinquish one of her holy me's. And so it started with the crown. That was the first me she had to give up. And then she had to give up her earrings and her necklace, throat chakra, and her breastplate, heart chakra, and her belt, and her, and her girdle. Like, so all of these different, and her robe, like there were so many things that she had to take off, right? And so she arrives then finally in the throne room of Ereshkigal, who is the underworld deity, and she is asked to, she is kind of thrown there, right? And then she is now naked and bowed low before the deity of the underworld. So she is stripped. There's nothing left of Inanna but the essence self that's there. And then any last piece of identity or ego Inanna was holding on to is slain and left on a meat hook for 3 days before she's finally resurrected. And so, I mean, this is what an underworld journey asks of us. And so when Pluto is in and this is, I want to say, in your own chart. So in natal charts, it's different than the chart of a sky. When we are looking at the mundane, this is called a mundane chart. So it's a transit chart, it's a chart of the current sky story. And we look at these planets as when we're looking at something like a mundane chart, so it's not a natal chart, it doesn't belong to a person, it belongs to all of us. It's the chart of the current moment, right? So when we're looking at this chart, we're looking more at the chart of the collective, like what's happening in the collective. And we tend to think of the planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars as the personal planets. And so what's happening with those planets will generally manifest in your everyday life. Then we look at Jupiter and Saturn as the social planets, and they will tell us kind of what is going on in the social sphere, like politics, social stuff, how are things progressing? And then Chiron is thought to be the rainbow bridge. So Chiron is out between Saturn and Uranus, and he is the rainbow bridge between the conscious, the social planets, and the unconscious. And then we get into the realm of Uranus being a transpersonal planet. So remember the idea of the collective unconscious and how Jung thought about the kind of like archetypal world and how there are all these thought forms and egregore and like Wetiko, these kind of concepts are sort of transpersonal in nature. And so Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto sort of rule this transpersonal realm. And so when we see Pluto in a mundane chart, it isn't as scary necessarily as it would be to have like Pluto conjunct your actual ascendant in the natal chart. So unless Pluto is making direct connections with planets in your chart, I don't want anyone to become afraid, right? I don't like people being worried about Pluto. More or less, what he asks us to do is have a kind of transpersonal, transformative experience as part of the collective unconscious, as in being part of the group. So he's asking you to transform in a particular way, kind of in service to the collective evolution. And so it's not necessarily as top heavy or as alchemically potent, let's say, as Pluto touching. Like when I found my birth mother and went through that whole just being kind of liquefied in transformation and really my very first kind of deep conscious underworld experience was when Pluto was on my ascendant at 7 Capricorn. So that's when it's like it's really personal. So the interesting thing about Pluto, so when Pluto then, when he's in a sign, essentially what he does is he reveals the shadows of that part of the chart or that part of the zodiac. And so when Pluto was in Capricorn, when he moved into Capricorn, we had the financial crisis. And then there has been this kind of process of having all like Capricorn rules hierarchy and government and closed systems. So government would be a closed system or corporations. And I think we've all gotten a really good education in how corrupt those things can be, those systems that govern our lives. And that's all been Pluto's work moving through Capricorn, revealing the shadows and allowing us to know that there really are things like a deep state. That's not even something I would have considered before Pluto's time here. There really are shadow governments, and there really is corruption is rampant inside of our government. And we thought we had something very special inside of the American experiment. And while I'm still very patriotic, I really believe in this experiment. I've studied a lot, especially astrology, of the founding fathers, and I believe in what they were trying to do. And I like the Constitution as a document, but I think we can say that and hold the both and where we are today is very different, I think, than what they envisioned for us at the start of our beautiful country. So we have now Pluto having moved through Capricorn, doing all of that, revealing the shadows in government and hierarchy. And now what he's going to do in Aquarius is reveal the shadows of being in exile. Like, we had so many people running to the edges because we were being, it was revealed how toxic the closed system was, right? So many people left the closed system because of that, and started pushing for progressive new ideas. Aquarius is the ideal. It rules idealism as an air sign, and futurism and technology and robotics and AI. It even rules like space and space force, aliens, all of that stuff. And so what's going to be revealed here for us is the shadow of those things. What is the shadow of idealism? What is the shadow? This is an interesting question. What is the shadow of hope? Aquarius in the tarot is related to the star card, and the star card is the great hope of humanity. It's that idea of the light, the end of the tunnel. So what is the shadow side of having hope? And if you really want to play with this one, what is the difference between hope and faith? And why is faith potentially more healthy, right? But just playing with those as an inquiry. So we'll be looking collectively at like the shadow of AI, the shadow of where technology is taking us. Is it moral? Is it right? Is it good? And all of that stuff, of course, is up for examination because we've got the nodes squaring Pluto, and Jupiter is here. And Jupiter is about truth, higher truth, making laws, right, is a Jupiterian thing. He's the philosopher, so really building and fleshing out a philosophy on where progress takes us. And what is the shadow of idealism? Because idealism is a perfected thing. It's a lot like an archetype in a sense, and but it isn't real, and it generally isn't achievable. And a lot of us can make ourselves sick getting stuck in the land of idealism, which is the way things should be, versus being, having the capacity to meet the moment as it is, and meet the world in its isness, right? So that's what will be being revealed in Aquarius's or Pluto's track through Aquarius. However, now we haven't had Pluto here since the French Revolution in the late 1700s. And so for us in this lifetime, every transit Pluto is having this year is a first for us, first ever. First time Mercury squared Pluto. It was the first Mercury-Pluto square with Pluto in Aquarius. It was a new way of experiencing these planetary configurations that we have happen all the time. Mercury will square Pluto umpteen times in Aquarius, but the first square he had right before a retrograde, he was square Pluto in Aquarius for the first time. So these are exciting times, but there's this tinge of unknownness. There's this tinge of newness. There is this tinge of evolution, like the kind that is revelatory, revolutionary. It's never been done before. And so it's also potentially scary time because, stuff we don't know, the unknown can be frightening and scary. And as all of these planets then have moved in a square to Pluto, a square energy challenges, and these are opening squares. So they touched Pluto, that began the Pluto Mercury cycle, or began the Pluto Venus cycle, right? Some of these haven't touched Pluto in Aquarius, but the last time they touched Pluto would have began their Pluto cycle. So even if Jupiter's last time he touched Pluto was in Capricorn, that's okay. Still the opening square. So think about it like the half waxing moon opening, right? It's not a closing square. All of these here are having their opening square to Pluto as they're moving through the zodiac. And square configurations create a challenge. They are like a trigger. It's like something flicking us, flicking us, flicking us to precipitate some form of action, right? Um, and and so we've had several squares to Pluto. We had Venus much earlier in the year. We've had Vesta. We all of this stuff that was in Aries earlier. So the Sun, Mercury, they've all made squares to Pluto, and we've had this just very active square period as signs have moved from the end of Aries into Taurus, and they're each kind of going over. So since the, a little bit prior to the eclipse, and then since the eclipse, there's just been this kind of energy of sort of agitation or that being flicked, right? But the issue is that these are fixed signs. So Aquarius, Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio are fixed signs. It's what their mode is. So if you see down here, you see the modes. There's cardinal, which is energy that initiates. So Aries is an initiating sign. Capricorn is an initiating sign. Sorry, Cancer and Libra. Those are the cardinal directions. They point to something, right? And then mutable means it's kind of like the end of a season where the two seasons are mixing, the weathers are mixing. Immutable energy tends to be very go with the flow. Cardinal energy wants to initiate something. Fixed signs happen in the middle of the season where the weather is set in stone. And fixed energy tends to have that sort of set in stone energy, right? It kind of has a gravity to it. It like has a crystallization to it. I'm a Scorpio, if you ever argue, or even the bull might be a better kind of example. Like when they talk about Taurus as being stubborn, it's that fixed energy. It's hard to move them off a spot. If you have an argument with somebody with strong fixed energy in their chart, it's difficult to change their mind, right? And so we have this energy of the square flicking. So it's and Pluto involved transformation, right? The invitation to transform. Then we have the impetus to transform. In it's like, but we're like standing in concrete. It's like for some reason the energy isn't moving us towards the transformation. So many people I've talked to have felt this similar kind of energetic signature that like when the sun went into Aries, we had that Aries energy, we finally felt that thrust of spring and like we're going to move forward. Pluto squaring Jupiter, which is still happening, is a big energy. There's lots of power behind it. And then I've talked to people who said, well, since the eclipses happened, I've felt just kind of stuck, like in I don't know land, right? And so Pluto squaring in fixed energy can kind of give this like weird kind of atmospheric tone or signature to it that's like, I want to move and I'm not moving, right? There's this kind of push-pull. That's the square. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then you've got Jupiter here at the nodes. And this is an incredible evolutionary signature in the sense that the North Node is kind of like our collective destiny, where we're heading. And in Taurus, this is about our values and our resources. Like what do we value? Are we investing in places that we value? What are our values around our resources? And then, of course, Taurus has to deal with the earth and the body and love and eros and all of those other things. But with Jupiter here, we're really looking at values. And you can hear people fighting over what they value in the collective. And Jupiter is elevating the conversation and helping us chart a new path forward. And I think there will be some things that change. I see what I've seen in the collective is, and I'm kind of on this trajectory myself where I used to be very left leaning prior to COVID and involved in politics. And what I'm seeing is like people so fed up with politics that they are leaving the political arena altogether, right? And that is a value choice. That is a choice. Where do I want to invest my resources, my time, my energy, my consciousness? It's not in the political arena. I don't find truth really on either side. And so for me, it feels like a futile investment. And so I am investing my energy in things like pleasure and eros and creating a more embodied life, let's say. Now, in evolutionary astrology, though, however, they tell us that when a planet is on what they call the bendings. So here we see the nodal axis. It's a straight line, right? It's always directly opposite, forms an opposition along an axis. Wherever there is a planet that is at a square, we have what we call a skipped step, right? And so this is the chart for Venus's ingress into Leo, where she will spend the next 4 months because this is where she goes retrograde. So we get a big, huge dose of Leo energy. So we've got Venus at the bendings and Pluto at the bendings, and they're in an opposition to each other. This will be the first Venus opposite Pluto with Pluto in Aquarius. So this will be a new energy. This is going to be about creativity, authenticity, the capacity to show up and be seen in our innocence, in our brilliance, in our light. Leo rules the sun, right? The sun is currently in Gemini, so there'll be something about speaking, being able to be seen here. And then opposing Pluto in Aquarius. And Aquarius is about the group, that sense of egalitarianism, or the community that springs up outside of the closed system. And we can see everybody doing that right now. And Aquarius also kind of paradoxically has to do with individuating from the group. It's part of that process. Leaving the closed system, leaving the consensus is that process of individuating. And so there's something very, let's say, a transformation into more of our own authenticity, letting our own light shine, but not doing it at the expense of others. Because with Aquarius, we're still keeping the group in mind. And it means like finding the sweet spot in not, and I'm speaking to the Leo Aquarius axis, not the planets, Venus and Pluto right now. So what is the sweet spot in being able to be yourself, show up, trust that you'll be received, be seen, but not doing it at the expense of making other people feel small. But on the other hand, not holding back or not making yourself small because you're afraid that your brightness is going to stamp out somebody else's light. How many people have that wound? I do. It's one of my inner child wounds, is that like if I shine too brightly, that I'm going to step on the light somehow of somebody else. And then I was in drama when I was younger. I loved being in drama, and I went out for shows and very often didn't get the parts and felt hurt and jealous, like it meant something about me that I wasn't chosen for the part. And so that's kind of some of the evolutionary lessons that this axis brings in is like, how do we show up and be seen in service to the whole? Like my light, my individuation, my shining my innocent part as bright as I can is actually in service in service to the collective. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard me talk about this book before. It's called The Archetypal Universe, and it's actually written by my mentor, who I apprenticed with, Ren Butler. Ren Butler is a student of Rick Tarnas and Stan Groff. And this is a book all about archetypal astrology. And he talks about, and in archetypal astrology, the archetypes are the most important thing. So we put priority on what the archetypes are saying by looking at things called planetary pairs. And planetary pairs are any planets that are making connections. So in this case, we have Venus having just ingressed into Leo, where she wants to be seen in her creativity, and Pluto in Aquarius, right? So the planetary pairs that we're looking at from an archetypal perspective are Venus and Pluto. And so he has this to say. I wanted to read some of this to you. Deep and intense passions, renewing and regenerating forces in relationships, the power of love and drive to unite, the interplay of beauty and the beast. It's like Eros and Thanatos. A tendency towards obsessive attractions, feelings of jealousy and possessiveness, passive aggression or manipulation, and the love of power. So, what are the character and themes of a Venus opposite Pluto? Primal feelings of love and attraction. Pluto is one of our two planets of personal power. Mars is the kind of power that we use to dominate, like when we want to dominate reality, when we want to dominate a game, when we want to go out and get something. He's the action of our mundane 3D will. And Pluto is that kind of power that is forged in the dark. It's the power that we gain from our pain and having traversed the underworld. It's that power that's related to our essence self and our soul, our own inner gnosis. It doesn't necessarily seek to power over, although in its toxic form it could. So, where was I? Sorry. Feelings of love and attraction, deep and intense passion, the sense of positive fatedness, operating in one's partnerships, renewing and regenerating forces in relationships, profound relationship understanding, and emotional resourcefulness. Pluto will always help us dig to the depths of our emotions. And sometimes that's what's needed in a relationship. Like somebody is holding back their deepest truth or not in touch with some part of their emotional field, and it's causing problems in relationships. So when Venus hooks up with Pluto, sometimes that can precipitate like a deep revealing between partners in relationships. A big, deep heart, and embrace the healing power of love, emotional and social healing, an instinct for approaching dark and heavy situations with grace and kindness, a capacity to love those in crisis, an undying love that transcends all darkness, emotional death and rebirth, the interplay of the beauty and the beast. Fair and foul are near of kin, and fair needs foul, I cried. And that's Yeats. Fair and foul are near of kin, and fair needs foul. So that's that Beauty and the Beast. Profound artistic gifts, creative potency and passion, primal art and beauty, persuasive sex appeal, Dionysian charisma, that's that charisma or the dark seductress, and some of the shadow qualities to look at. Overbearing sweetness or friendliness, a manipulatively yin style, passive forms of aggression, a pushy or obnoxious aesthetic, a love of power, an infatuation with power, urges to control one's friends and loved ones, intense projections damaging one's friendships, romantic obsessions, dangerous or forbidden love, harmful temptations, sexual addictions, throwaway relationships, urges to use sex or beauty for ulterior purposes, habit of destroying that what one loves, loving what is lost or dead, uh, over longing for something. I think he means like over, like longing to the point of being taken out of one's own current of life force. Like we spend so much time in the longing and yearning realms. The shadow side of beauty, dangerous beauty, and the challenging side of being too beautiful. There's also feelings of jealousy, possessiveness, kind of like that sense of betrayal being in the air. Here's another quote: love is a fire, but whether it's going to warm your heart or burn down your house, you can never tell. That's Joan Crawford. Vulgar or coarse sexuality, a raunchy or crude style, sexuality as a dark um, continent, mixtures of pleasure, and the perinatal plutonic themes of suffering, aggression, demonic energies, scatology, pyrocatharsis, and transcendence, ambivalent attraction and repulsion, and the dark side, that dark side of coming close, like a close call. So Eros and Thanatos are beauty and the beast, or Kamamara, desire and death, is like an archetype that comes up between Pluto and Venus. Love as a cosmic force, Shakti energy, the lotus as a symbol of the sexual power of the feminine principle in Greco-Roman mythology. And I love that as symbolism or imagery of Pluto and Venus, that kind of the lotus growing out of the mud, out of the depths. Tantra is certainly a Venus Pluto kind of archetypal expression, the sacred prostitute of the matriarchal era, the orgiastic deities and festivals, Ishtar, Padma, Walpurga, the May Queen, goddesses of sexual dominance such as Kali, Ashura, Lilith, and her daughters of the night hags, Hecate. Underworld or abducted goddesses such as Kore, Persephone, Europa, Helen of Troy, Leda the Swan, Pasiphae the Bull, the Minotaur. These are all kind of archetypes of a Pluto Venus, right? And so as we move, this is happening June 5th, the ingress of Pluto to Venus into Leo. And like we said, because she will retrograde here, she will be in Leo for 4 months. She's moving into Leo right in between the Black Moon Lilith, so our dark goddess, one of the goddesses that was listed as an archetype of a Venus Pluto, and Mars, which adds a power and potency to this chart, right? And to our Venus. And Venus then in opposition to Pluto, what does an opposition do? Well, it asks for integration. It asks us, opposing forces have to somehow be reconciled and integrated. And how we do integration is through meeting and relationship we relate to. That's why Aries is the archetype of the self, and Libra is the archetype of other, and Libra signifies is relationship. All oppositions are of the nature of the Aries Libra axis. And when the nodes finally move into Aries and Libra, that will be what's on the table from an evolutionary perspective. How can we meet and be in relationship with the isness of all parts of our lives? That's going to be the evolutionary intention. And I will do a video about the nodes changing axis. Right now, I just want to focus on what some of our work here is. So Venus opposite Pluto is asking us to have an integration of our shadow side, an integration of the darkness into our Venusian quality. And it's asking us to do that so that we can show up in our light and be seen. So what? So we can be of service to others. because us being in our radiant Leo like heart is what is in service to the collective. The more people who show up in their authenticity, in their compassion, in their humanity, without that ego self, or the ego being the driver. We need the ego. I'm not one who thinks we need to get rid of the ego. The ego needs to be in service to the soul project, not the soul being extracted from for the ego to get its needs met, right? So that's important. So here, what this chart is, as Leo makes this, or as Venus makes this beautiful first new ingress into her sign, and where then she will be for the next 4 months. But more importantly, we know as Venusian priestesses that the last cycle began with Venus in Capricorn, right? And so the next Venus cycle is going to be a Venus Leo cycle. And so it's not just going to be about showing up and being seen in our brightness for the next 4 months. No, the whole next 18 months is going to be in service to this project, which of course I'll be talking more about. I'll be talking about it publicly quite a bit, but like, get ready to be visible, and to be visible from that deepest part of your heart, the part of your heart that has been through the dark and knows what the dark is like, that's been cracked open by the dark and now can be felt, right? Like it's time to take inventory in our lives about, can the people around me feel me? It's a very Leo Venus. Leo is the radiant heart of the king, right? That big hearted, the Leo, the lion hearted king that is really in service to his kingdom and the people in his kingdom. His life is duty and sacrifice to them for the pleasure and innocence of his heart, and what the heart derives from sharing pleasure, play, and innocence with other people and being of service to them, right? And so one of the questions I want us to start traveling with is, can the people in my life that I have relationships with, can they feel me? And if they can't, what is covering my heart that is making it so? What shields do I have? What egos, what protection mechanisms, what resistance, what patterns are overlaying the heart so that when I show up anywhere, I'm not really felt. I'm coming in the vehicle of my identity cloak and people can't really feel me, right? So that's the big question. All right, I've spoken for quite a while now. I just wanted to go over some of this astrology with you. I wanted to let you know that if you're feeling like transformation is on the docket, but for some reason it's not moving, that's sort of this fixed energy, and it's okay. It's okay to just sort of stew in it. Nothing is wrong. It will move on. It's all perfect. It's all got an evolutionary purpose. And don't force it. The only thing you can really do here is surrender to the underworld journey if there's one for you to go on. That's the only action. If there's no underworld journey for you to go on, I want you to just sort of be okay. Say, this is the astrology. We're in fixed energy. Something is asking to be transformed, but I'll know what and when to go when that knowing is revealed to me. Also, the other thing is that potentially you aren't going on that journey or transforming because you're in resistance somewhere. And so I suppose I should go back and restate that it's okay to sit where you are, so long as you're open and surrendered to going on the journey, should there be one. So potentially, if you're feeling that frustration of not moving, it's also an invitation from the moon and Pluto to look at where you're in resistance and not receptivity to life, right? Not receiving life fully, or how much of your life is spent inside of a resistance pattern. So I hope this was helpful. I love you all. I'll post this soon. Bye-bye.